Hello and welcome to Literature Out Loud. Literature Out Loud is among the wonderful things that are happening today. I hope you had a good day. Most of us really did. I'd like to welcome the new year with a wonderful new author that is new to me and maybe new to you, named Hannah Tinti. She has been very involved with short stories. She was working with selected shorts on National Public Radio. She has done a lot of work with magazines, and she's also an educator. She's a wonderful, fresh, beautiful, irreverent new voice for the new year. And I have two wonderful voices to bring her words to you, Nina Gabianelli and Meredith Daniel, both of whom can read like nobody's business. So I hope you will enjoy these stories as much as I do. I know you'll enjoy the readings. We're going to start out with Nina reading Miss Waldron's Red Colobus. It's great.
Thank you. Miss Waldron was an American. When she turned 12 years old, she was deposited in a New Hampshire boarding school to be raised by nuns. She watched from the window of her room as her father drove away in his forest green MG, the wheels leaving a trail of dust on the gravel road. Then Miss Waldron turned to the nun, who had been cheerily unpacking her things, and slapped her across the face. This was the first picture taken by the private detectives. Miss Waldron, with her hand out, a blur of hair and teeth. The sun was shining through the latticework behind her, sending a patterned shadow of bars across the curtains. The detectives were three educated men from Minnesota. They had seen tornadoes and men killed with pitchforks, but they have never seen a girl hit a nun. Miss Waldron's father had hired the private detectives to keep an eye on his daughter. Each week they sent a telegram detailing her life, what clothes she was wearing, what kind of cereal she ate, what hour she had hitchhiked to the nearest saloon. Sometimes they sent pictures. These messages were met with silence. The men sometimes wondered if the father read them at all. Miss Waldron spent the next few years running away. Some of these attempts were more successful than others. At 14, she disappeared at the zoo, slipping into the foliage with the primate house. The detectives found her 2 days later, living with a family of lemurs, her uniform bargained for bananas. At 15, she hired a crop duster with her birthday money. The plane touched down in a field behind the school during a class in calisthenics. The girls finished their round of jumping jacks, and Miss Waldron broke from the line, her white legs streaking across the grass. The pilot dropped her off near the train station, where she joined a passing carnival. After reporting this, the detectives received their first telegram. "Fetch her from the circus and return her to the nuns." And finally, caught up with Miss Waldron a few weeks later in Louisiana, where she was performing a veiled trapeze artist. The nuns made an example of her. This example involved the scrubbing of toilets, the repetition of the rosary, and silent but carefully directed guilt. It did not stop Miss Waldron from escaping, but they noticed it kept the other girls from getting close to her. Then came the Italian. Maria arrived at the convent with an enormous mane of dark hair that fell to her waist, and a personal maid whose job was to take care of it. She was the illegitimate daughter of a contessa and her gardener, drank tumblers of amaretto liqueur, and wore high-necked dresses that were specially tailored to hide a stunning red birthmark in the shape of a penis. On a class trip to Silver Lake, the girls were partnered together for a canoe ride. As they set out across the water, Miss Waldron asked the Italian what she did for fun. Maria spun around, nearly upsetting the boat, and said, "Never will I have happiness away from Fredo." Fredo, Miss Waldron soon learned, was Maria's stepbrother from the Contessa's brief third marriage. He had thick eyebrows and sideburns that went down to his chin. In the 3 weeks the new siblings had spent together, they managed to commit 6 mortal sins and 47 venial. Maria explained their plans to get married, and as her paddle maid soft spirals through the water, said, "You must come visit us," in a quiet, conspiratorial way that reminded Miss Waldron of characters in a novel, inviting each other over to their country estates. Maria remained at the boarding school for 2 months, and during that time Miss Waldron did not run away. She enjoyed hearing about the countries Maria had traveled to and what Fredo had done underneath the dining room table. Maria was scheming to get transferred to a boarding school near her stepbrothers in London. "No more New England," she said, with distaste, and was true to her word. Soon after, she was standing in the front hall with her maid and her luggage and her hair braided neatly, waiting for the driver. A week later, Miss Waldron convinced a team of Navy cadets to infiltrate the boarding school and smuggle her out. She returned 1 month later, escorted by the private detectives, and brought back stories of submarines and speakeasies, coral reefs and coconuts, a Bessie Smith record, a long black cigarette holder, a pair of high heels, and a venereal disease. Miss Waldron had seen her father only 3 times since he dropped her off at the boarding school in his sports car, twice for Christmas and once for a Memorial Day picnic. When he heard what she was being treated for, he arrived at the hospital in a storm, overcoat flapping, goggles strapped to his head, leather gloves in hand. She could hear him coming down the hall toward her room. This was something the private detectives did not photograph. The girl crouched in the corner in her hospital gown, her legs bare, her hands at the back of her neck, her eyes darting from the window to the door as it slammed open. He called her a filthy animal. Then he crossed the floor, then he kicked her, then he left. Miss Waldron curled around the ache in her stomach and listened to her father's footsteps. She'd had a fever for weeks. The sweat covered her body in a thick paste. It hurt so much to go to the bathroom that she had stopped eating and drinking. Her chubby frame had been peeled down so that you could see the bones in her fingers, see how tight the skin was around her wrists, notice the paleness of her feet. Her skin was burning, and in certain spots it was as if large, razor-sharp needles were being pressed slowly into her flesh. She wished that she would die. Instead, she was sent to England. At finishing school, she was put under the direct supervision of an ancient but merciless woman named Madame Youplay. Madame Youplay had once been a courtesan. She was skilled with a whip, and for a time being quite famous for snapping buttons off the waistcoats of men at parties. When she lost her looks, she changed her name, moved to London, opened Madame Youplay's finishing school for young ladies, and quickly developed a reputation for turning troubled girls into debutantes. Miss Waldron did not slap the maid when she arrived with her steamer trunk, but she refused to tip the driver. The man caused such a scene that Madame Youplay had to pay him herself. For this embarrassment, Miss Waldron was sent to the attic. The attic bedrooms could only be locked from the outside. They were the hottest rooms in the summer and the coldest in the winter. The walls were orange and the ceilings red. Girls were sent there to be broken. At Madame Youplay's finishing school for young ladies, Miss Waldron became acquainted with which fork to use, the mysteries of the corset, and the proper way to enter a room. She learned how to arrange flowers, how to play the harp, how to keep her stomach from making embarrassing noises in public. She was taught how to smile through pain, how to turn her head into the light, how to lay her hand on a table. She practiced the intonation of certain words and phrases in French, German, Spanish, Arabic, Swedish, and Italian, as well as proper English. But Madame said her accent was abominable. Miss Waldron came close to asking her father for help. She wrote him a plaintive letter full of promises and regrets, but she never mailed it. She tried to think of other people who might come to her aid. The other students respected her wildness and enjoyed gossiping about her adventures, but few would cross the line and call her their friend. Miss Waldron considered her voice instructor, her makeup instructor, her poise instructor, Then she remembered the Italian. She found Maria and Fredo living together in a small Soho flat, both having renounced their inheritances. Maria now tended her hair herself. It was full of split ends. She kept a tiny pair of scissors on a ribbon around her neck, and whenever there was a lull in the conversation, she would begin individually clipping the ragged strands. Fredo drew pictures of tourists on the street. At night, they made love so loudly the neighbors called the police. Miss Waldron began to visit them on Saturdays after confession. Together, they would go to the local saloons and drink until early evening. No one at the finishing school questioned these long absences at first, but Miss Waldron's father had his private detectives, and Madame had her intuition. So it was not long before the group was discovered and flushed out. 10 lashes were given to Miss Waldron's soft white behind, as well as 2 weeks of nothing but oatmeal. But it was too late. The damage had already been done, for on one sunny afternoon, at a heavy round wooden table at the Bright Heads Tavern, Fredo introduced Miss Waldron to the great white hunter, Mr. Willoughby Lowe. He was not what she expected. Miss Waldron had seen movies of hunters, Tarzan and King Kong, and they wore jodhpurs and white pith helmets and were always clean-shaven and had clefts in their chin. Willoughby Lowe had a square head, small red lips like a woman's, a thick beard that covered most of his face, and only one ear. The other had been blown off while he was shooting crocodiles in South America. "I'm lucky," he said. "The guide lost a leg. I just passed out and learned to say, 'Eh?'" He cocked his head at Miss Waldron and looked at her curiously, as though she'd just said something important he'd missed. His face seemed older than his body. She noticed fine lines carving their way around his cheeks, across his forehead, and stamping rings around his eyes. She could see where his skin would crease if he chose to smile. The more Miss Waldron looked at Willoughby Lowe, the more she began to think of meat. Round steak, T-bones, filet mignon, red, cool, thick flesh marbled over onto itself. His shoulders were hulking and his back was curved with muscle, thick slabs on either side of his spine like a well-toned side of beef. He pushed up his sleeve to show them a tattoo of a spiral he'd received as an initiation rite from a tribe in Papua New Guinea. She could see the veins in his arm popping and sprouting like rivers of blue, coursing and connecting just below his skin. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought of running her fingers along those veins, reading them like Braille, and imagined the experience would be like singing. Later, she discovered that underneath his clothes, he was covered with hair. It coursed down his neck, across his chest, and onto his shoulders, fanned over his back, swirled onto his legs, and concentrated in a thick, dark forest between his legs. The only place he was hairless was on his behind. "Like a baboon," Willoughby said. The hair frightened her at first. She did not know where to put her hands. It was coarse and curled and smelled slightly earthy, like a pile of fallen leaves. He bristled as he pressed against her, and the difference between their bodies made Miss Waldron feel suddenly tiny and weak, like a hairless newborn. She dug her fingers into his fur and clung to him. Everything changed when he started to sweat. A glistening sheen came over his body and he began to glow. He buried his face in her neck and the hair softened and flattened out until it felt like feathers, as if she were being stroked with tiny silken brushes. She was covered with a slick wetness. Her hands slid from his neck, from his shoulders, down his back, from everything she tried to hold on to. Later, as she stood before the washbin in the corner of the room, she saw that she was covered with his hair, tiny black curly strands stuck to the film of sweat still hovering across her breasts and stomach. She drew a finger from one nipple to the other, leaving behind a clear trail as if she were shaving. "Look," she said, spinning around, but Willoughby Lowe was already snoring away. Madame Uplay could tell what had happened. Miss Waldron was glowing like a firecracker, and there was an arch in her back that had not been there before. Madame beat her ferociously. Miss Waldron gripped the sides of the bed, bit her lips, and tried to hold still. The private detectives also knew. They had followed Miss Waldron to Willoughby Lowe's hotel, watching her making love through the keyhole, sucked in their breath as she drew her finger across her breasts, and regarded her over the tops of newspapers as she whisked through the lobby. They had grown fond of Miss Willoughby over the years. They had watched her develop from a spindly child to a woman with serious character. There were times when they thought of her as their own daughter, biting their nails as she climbed out of windows, hitchhiked down highways, and learned how to drink whiskey. But they were silent parents, like ghosts, only witnesses. They were never able to tell her no, to say stop, to give her warning, or to stroke her head while she was sleeping. They laid fingers on her bony elbow as they returned her to her keepers, and tried hard to find ways from caring too much. Sometimes the private detectives wondered if Miss Waldron knew they were there, recording every minute of her outside world. There were moments, a hesitant smile, a glance into the darkness before she slipped through a door, that said she did. At least this is what they secretly hoped, that sometimes she was doing what she was doing simply to give them something exciting to watch. So when they saw Miss Waldron on the roof of the finishing school with a hat box in her hand, the private detective exchanged knowing hand signals. Before long, a ladder slid across from one of the neighboring buildings, and after steadying it, Miss Waldron crawled across the open space 6 stories high, the handle of the hat box in her teeth, her dress hitched around her waist, and her silk panties flashing for all the world to see. The detectives dispatched a telegram to Miss Waldron's father. Daughter has escaped from Madame Uplays. Stop. On her way to Ghana. Stop. Appears to be in love. Stop. Instructions? They received no reply. On the steamship to Africa, Miss Waldron posed as Willoughby Lowe's personal secretary. This did not fool anyone. At night, their moans and lovers' curses could be heard throughout the ship, vibrating along the edges of the steel hull, echoing back and forth into the furnace of the coal room, singing out across the waves like whale songs from the propeller. The expedition team, scientists, tossed and turned in their cabins, and the crew groaned down in their bunks. When they arrived, Miss Waldron realized that everything in Africa was covered with dust. The roads, the animals, even the people. Willoughby told her they used it to ward off flies. Miss Waldron saw the point and quickly traded her dresses for native clothes, soft layers of light woven cotton. Her high-heeled shoes were used to bargain with the porters, and she slipped into a pair of Willoughby's boots. The scientists had arranged for everything in advance. As they divided their boxes of sample test tubes and books on species identification between the porters, a guide appeared. Willoughby seemed to know him, and after a friendly exchange of greetings, he whispered to Miss Waldron that the man was a slave. Once they were in the jungle, the slave coordinated everything: where the tents should go, how the food should be stored, and when to start the fire. As darkness came, and they sat around the flames, Miss Waldron listened to the sounds of the forest and studied him. It seemed as though his skin had been peeled off in strips. She found it hard to distinguish his nostrils among the lines of pink and brown and black. Bubbly sections of destroyed muscle and scar tissue crisscrossed his body like worms. Despite this, she could see underneath that he was strong, about 30 years old. His eyes were large and bright, and she noticed that when he closed them, the lids disappeared into the tangle of his face. He did not sleep with the rest of them. Once the team had retired, the slave climbed a tree and tied a hammock among the branches. From there, he kept watch over the fire. He had a machete beside him to kill the snakes, and a shotgun to frighten the poachers. In the morning, Miss Waldron watched Willoughby Lowe unpack his guns. She asked about the slave's face, and was told he'd been locked in an oven. His master had caught him trying to escape, and by the time he was dragged from the cinders, most of his skin was gone. The slave was brought back to life by a witch doctor and later sold to one of the directors of the Natural History Museum, who used him as a point man for the African exhibitions. "Why don't you release him?" Miss Waldron asked. "He's got a much better life with us," said Willoughby. After a breakfast of bacon, the group headed off into the jungle with a jar of water and a rack of loaded weapons. The slave led the way. Miss Waldron carried a slender pistol in her back pocket and kept her eyes on the canopy. They were looking for monkeys. Willoughby shot a chimpanzee and 3 baboons, then announced that it was time for tea, biscuits from a can and weak English breakfast. Miss Waldron wandered over to the carcasses of the animals with her cup and saucer. She had watched them drop from the trees. The guns exploded and the monkeys fell like fruit, whipping through the leaves, breaking through branches, rolling down to thuds in the dirt. The screeching and rustling that followed as other animals fled the area was unnerving. She had not realized how many had been so near. Miss Waldron reached out with a finger and touched the wrinkled nose of a dead baboon. Its mouth was open, its tongue bloody through sharp incisors, but its eyes were closed in a sweet way, as though it was sleeping. She glanced around, then leaned forward and kissed it. The private detective snapped the picture and sent it airmail to Miss Waldron's father. They had spent the day sweating, hacking through the jungle with machetes, spraying themselves with bug repellent, and dodging wild boars. Their cigarettes were damp. They watched Miss Waldron through their binoculars and tried to keep a low profile. They began to wonder if there wasn't easier work. Meanwhile, Miss Waldron learned to climb trees. For days, she had been watching the slave wrap his bare feet against bark and propel himself up into the canopy. It reminded her of the days she had spent in the circus, and in the early morning she would practice shinnying up the trunk. Before long, she made it a foot off the ground, then 2, then 3. She began spending her afternoon siesta in a low-slung hammock, which rose each day among the vines along with her ability. At dusk, Willoughby would go looking for her. There had been a change in Miss Waldron since they moved into the forest, but Willoughby was used to seeing people go native. He'd done it himself once or twice. As the porters prepared meals, Willoughby would rouse her by calling out the courses. "Plum pudding with rum sauce," he would shout into the bush. "Chateaubriand, simmering in wine." Sooner or later, he would hear leaves rustling and then the soft thud of her small feet hitting the ground. Miss Waldron brought a rifle. She'd been practicing with heavier guns, firing at empty biscuit cans and melons. She moved through the jungle next to Willoughby, and this time, when she felt him sight a monkey, she was not shaken by the shot or the sounds of the other animals fleeing. She drew near as the men tied the creature's arms and legs together and slid it on a stick for carrying. The monkey had been shot once through the stomach. What remained of the coat shimmered and bristled, a combination of reds. The long, thin fingers curled tightly into themselves, holding on to nothing. Its face was a tight black mask. Miss Waldron reached down and touched the tail, and the monkey turned around and sank its teeth into her arm. In one moment, the slave raised his machete and sliced through the animal's neck, so that when Miss Waldron pulled her arm away, the head came with it. "It's a colobus," said Willoughby. "I've never seen one like this before." He pushed his fingers into the nose and eased the jaw back and delicately took the monkey's head from Miss Waldron's arm, as if he were removing a bracelet. That night, the scientists broke open the whiskey. They had spent all day taking the colobus apart and had decided that it was an entirely new species. Willoughby promised the scientists that he would shoot 10 more. He promised Miss Waldron that he would name it after her. They sat around the fire and told bawdy stories, and when they were very drunk, they danced. They did waltzes and two-steps, minuets, and the Charleston, all to the sounds of flutes carved out of gourds. Willoughby shook his rump. Miss Waldron did the can-can. The men shot their guns in the air, and they passed out one by one. The private detectives waited patiently nearby in a grove of cacao trees. They had received one line from Miss Waldron's father. "Return Monkey Girl to be finished." The detectives lingered until they could hear Willoughby low snoring. The moon shone silver as they stepped over the sleeping scientists. Miss Waldron's feet were dangling out of the tent. In the glow, they looked half alive, like fish freshly killed. The private detectives held above the ankles and silently yanked the rest of her out. Miss Waldron was dreaming. She was in a hospital bed and the sheets were binding her legs. There were monkey skulls holding her wrists. She could hear the footsteps of her father approaching. Above her were tangled roots with eyes. The slave leaned forward and told her to wake up. When she did, she found herself being carried over the heads of the detectives into the jungle. It was as if she were sinking. The moonlight flickered through the leaves like waves. She could hear the slop, slop of her kidnappers' shoes as they hurried through the mud. A veil of moss passed over her face. It tasted like cobwebs. She sensed a weight in her stomach where her father had kicked her, knotted like a stone. The teeth marks on her arm began to scream. Miss Waldron heard them and started to fight. She struggled and flailed and punched and bit. She was a full-grown woman now, and it took all the strength of the 3 detectives to keep possession of her. There were shadows overhead. She knew that somewhere in them there were limbs to hang on to. Miss Waldron stretched, hoping to catch a branch. She imagined the trees reaching back for her, long arms giving chase through the darkness. Her fingertips touched bark, touched fur, touched skin. Then she felt something take hold of her hands and she was lifted into the canopy. Miss Waldron was missing. So was the slave. Willoughby Lowe searched the jungle, tearing through creepers, behind every bush, underneath every gathering of leaves. He was inconsolable. The scientists were convinced the monkey bite had made Miss Waldron mad. For several weeks, the private detectives staked out Willoughby's camp, hoping to catch her again. They trailed the expedition search party and even learned to climb trees, boosting each other on their shoulders and clinging to vines. They dusted the forest for fingerprints. They hunted all day and into the night until finally, nervous, they informed her father of the escape. The detectives received an immediate response. "No more bananas. Stop. You are fired." They decided to continue the search. The private detectives contacted other private detectives. They called on spies. They called on favors. They got in touch with infiltrators and double agents, bounty hunters, and Boy Scouts. Anyone who might see something and report it. They cast their nets wide and waited. They got a tip. Miss Waldron had been seen on a camel going toward Egypt. The detectives donned their fedoras and headed out of the jungle. But when they reached the desert, her trail had turned to dust. A few weeks later, Miss Waldron was sighted near a Hindu temple in Kashmir. A month afterward, she was in Papua New Guinea. 6 months passed, and she was sledding through the Yukon, wrapped in furs, urging her team of dogs on with a smile and an occasional kick of the boot. The detectives missed her. They kept missing her. Years passed, and they grew weary of traveling without a destination. Eventually, they moved back to Minnesota and became security guards. They read about her Colobus in zoological textbooks and issues of Primate Monthly. Sometimes they would hear from an old contact, a Miss Waldron had been heard, a Miss Waldron had been smelled, a Miss Waldron had been spotted in the trees. These sightings grew fewer and farther between, and then they stopped completely.
Nice.
Isn't that great?
That is fun.
Oh my gosh. It's just so, I can see the trees and the monkeys and
She's
fun.
fabulous.
Isn't she? I like the reckless spirit for sure. Just the idea of being out and about, traveling. It's so sexy right now. Right? I just want to go. I just want to get on a bus. I just want to get on a train.
This is Hannah Tinti's Gallus. Alan Perkin was a short, balding man who was very good at getting other people to do things for him. He had, for example, never learned to tie his shoes. As a boy, his mother had crouched each morning by his feet as he ate his breakfast, threaded the eyelets on his leather uppers, and pulled his laces together in a bow. When Alan Perkin married, his wife took on this responsibility and dutifully performed it every morning after breakfast. If, by chance, one of his shoes became untied during the day, Alan Perkin would politely ask someone standing close by to do it for him. By the time he had reached the age of 30, everyone in town had tied Alan Perkin's shoes at one time or another. Alan Perkin owned Perkin's Candy, famous for its saltwater taffy. He was introduced to the business by his father, who had taught him to hire pretty girls just out of high school to stand in the store window and pull. The girls had to be skilled and would go through a rigorous training program in the back room before being allowed up front. People often made special trips to Perkins just to stand outside the large glass and watch the pretty girls in their hairnets stretch, attach, and twist the long, shining goo between them. The business was a successful one in that it allowed Mr. Perkin to provide his wife with an ample house, several servants, and the means to support her hobby of raising chickens. It pleased Mrs. Perkin to have a morning ritual, and something about the clucking and spreading of chicken feed made her feel productive. Each morning, Mary, the cook, helped Mrs. Perkin on with her apron, a pinafore of sorts, to protect the front of her dress from spoiling. Then Mrs. Perkin opened the door to the backyard, picked up the basket of seeds set there earlier by the gardener, opened her mouth, and began to cluck. Before her marriage, Mrs. Alan Perkin had trained briefly for a position as a veterinary nurse. One day, Mrs. Perkin, née Diana Walmot, turned a page in her zoological textbook and came upon a skeletal diagram of Gallus, the wild red jungle chicken of Southeast Asia. She was taken with the curve of the beak, the diminutive skull, and the fine, thin bones that fanned out to form the base of the wings. It looks like a little freak baby, she thought. A tiny little freak baby with enormous hands. Diana, the soon-to-be Mrs. Perkin, wept, and from that moment fell in love with poultry. Mrs. Perkin slid her hand into the basket of seed. How cool and dry it felt. She ran her fingers back and forth and thought of pebbles, of sand, of starlight. A rustling began in the corner shed as the hens made their way down the ramp. Their tiny heads turned and bobbed together in short, rapid movements, as if it took all the power of their little brains to decide that, yes, there was noise. And yes, the noise meant food. And yes, they must move to the noise to get the food. Mrs. Perkin clucked louder and looked for Romeo, her rooster. Romeo had once been a champion cockfighter. His spurs were cut for steel gaffs, used to rip open the throats of his opponents. His feathers were a glistening blue-black color, and his comb was a brilliant yellow. Set against the shining dark plumage, it made him look like a king. Mrs. Perkin had rescued Romeo from an unruly group of local young men who were backing him in fights across the county. On her way home from delivering Mr. Perkin his lunch one day, she had witnessed Romeo spar with Tootsie, the local favorite. Dust and blood and feathers filled the air. Mrs. Perkin watched and felt a sense of exhilaration. When Romeo ruffled his feathers in triumph, she knew that she must have him. It had taken almost 6 months for her to bring the rooster back to some form of domesticity, and she guarded that control with the possession close to motherhood. The basket of seed was now empty. Romeo had missed his breakfast. Mrs. Perkin tapped her foot. 1, 2. Then she asked the gardener to look for him and went inside to phone the neighbors. Mrs. Kowalski had not seen Romeo. Neither had Mrs. Bronston. Mrs. de Whipple had not laid eyes on him either, although she had noticed that some of her own chickens were behaving strangely. Mrs. Perkin thanked the neighboring wives, hung up the phone, took her place at the breakfast table, and began to worry. At that moment, Mr. Alan Perkin came downstairs with his shoes untied. He took his seat, spread his napkin across his lap, picked up a small silver spoon from the table, and used it to tap the soft-boiled egg in the tiny porcelain cup in the center of his plate. Everything in his morning routine followed a precise schedule that he left each night before with the butler. "Good morning, my dear," said Mr. Alan Perkin. His wife did not answer him. She was looking out the window and wondering where Romeo could be. This bothered Mr. Perkin. When he came to his breakfast table, he announced his arrival by greeting his spouse and expected a cordial reply. "Hello," he said. His wife had upset the balance of his day, and he wanted her to know it. Mrs. Perkin did notice the change in tone of her husband's voice, and it immediately aggravated her. Her jaw tightened, and she turned her chair slightly away from the table. This move worried her husband. He mentally flipped through his behavior over the past week. An anniversary, her birthday, and came up empty. He ate his soft-boiled egg in a confused silence. His wife ate nothing and continued to look out the window. Soon it came time for Mr. Alan Perkin to leave for work. He checked his watch, put down his spoon, and waited for his wife to tie his shoes. Mrs. Perkin gazed at the yard outside. She remembered running her fingers along Romeo's neck and how he would bob his head when she touched him, as though he were enthusiastically agreeing with something she'd said. Mr. Perkin cleared his throat. He was very good at getting strangers to tie his shoes, but he was not used to using his persuasive charms on his wife. "It's 9:30, he said. I need to go to work. Then go, Mrs. Perkins said. I can't very well go without my shoes. Mrs. Perkins jumped in her chair. She was not used to being shouted at, especially first thing in the morning, and most certainly not at breakfast. I'm sorry, dear, she said. I had forgotten. She stood quickly and crossed the floor to his side. She kneeled by her husband's feet. She picked up the laces and drew them as tightly as she could before tying them together in an impossible knot. Then she rose from the floor and left the room. Mr. Perkin finished his coffee and stood up. He noticed that his shoes were quite snug, and as he exited the house and began his jaunt to work, he realized that they were snug to the point of discomfort. And by the time he reached the candy store, his feet were pounding, and he was carrying on with a slight limp. He curtly asked one of the cashiers to loosen the knots, but his wife had tied them so tightly they would not come undone. The cashier suggested cutting the laces to free his feet. But Mr. Perkin was not only a persuasive man, he was a frugal one as well. And ruining a perfectly good pair of laces was, to him, a crime. Just forget it, he snapped, and began to imagine torturous ways to get even with his wife. He kicked open the door to his office, threw himself in a chair, and propped his feet up on his desk to release the pressure. It was only then that Mr. Perkin noticed the splash of gray and white along the side of his heel. He swiped it with his finger, brought his finger to his nose, and recognized the smell of the hen house. The cashier who had failed at untying Mr. Perkins' shoes was named Michael Sheehy. He was a dark man with a slight frame and a lazy eye that slid around in its socket when he spoke. He had been a cashier there for 5 years. In that time, he had often tied Mr. Alan Perkins' shoes. Michael did not particularly enjoy crouching on the ground and relacing his employer's shiny Italian leathers, but he did enjoy the benefits of being the only male employee at Mr. Perkins' candy store. Michael Sheehy used to wear an eye patch. When he started at Perkins' candy store, he traded in the patch for a story. He told everyone that his sight had been damaged in combat, a near-death experience with a German soldier on the outskirts of Marseille. He repeated the story often, whenever he felt he was in jeopardy of losing his job or whenever he saw a customer staring at his roving eye. In fact, Michael Sheehy had never been to war. He was disqualified for poor sight and flat feet. Still, the young high school girls working at Perkins' candy store found the eye both repulsive and romantic. They became nervous under its gaze and would shiver in excitement and fear when the man placed a warm hand on their shoulders or against the small of their backs. When Mr. Perkins slammed the door to his office, Michael felt something inside him pick up and turn sour. He looked over at the girls in the window with their hairnets. They were twisting, turning the taffy into a spiral of sugar and smiling sweetly at the crowd gathered to watch them. They were very clean and very pretty. Michael cast his good eye on Emmeline Doherty, head taffy puller at Perkins Candy. Her cheeks were flushed, her long brown hair pulled back in a net, and her arms moved smooth as a machine. Michael slid open the back door of the counter and picked a piece of peanut butter taffy. He held it in his hand, and he could feel the candy begin to soften and lose its shape. Then he peeled away the wax paper, took aim, and threw it across the store at Emmeline. The taffy hit Emmeline in the back of her head. She cried out, and a shiny loop slipped and drooped from the pull. Emmeline and her partner frantically tried to twist and jerk the goo back to the proper stiffness, but it was too late. The taffy was lost. A soft puddle of maple walnut on the floor. Emmeline Doherty was not a girl who made mistakes. When she was a child, her father had been tragically killed, smothered accidentally on a Sunday promenade by a mound of bluefin tuna. A faulty crane unloading nets from a fishing boat had snapped on the docks and buried him. For this reason, Emmeline harbored a substantial fear of the unexpected. Her life became a plan that, with the help of her mother, Emmeline had mapped out at an early age. In her mind, she saw her future in degrees of longitude and latitude, with projections of normal faults and anticlinal axis. Her position at Perkins Candy as head taffy puller was an important contour on her topographical existence. 3 years of salary to be saved for school to become a dental hygienist. As Emmeline watched the candy slip from her fingers, she felt a familiar panic of loss. Emmeline ran into Mr. Perkins' office. She didn't knock. In a high, tight voice, she reported what happened, then burst into tears and begged him not to fire her. She turned and showed him the evidence, a wad of taffy stuck fast in a mass of hair and net. Mr. Perkins told Emmeline to calm herself and offered her a piece of peppermint-flavored taffy, a defensive gesture he used when he wanted someone to stop talking. He suggested quietly that Emmeline take the rest of the day off to recover from the accident. Then he told her to send Michael to his office and bent over to resume work on the knots his wife had tied that morning. Mrs. Perkins was looking for Romeo. Impatient with the gardener's progress, she had called on Mary to bring her the shawl, a long and heavy crocheted piece Mrs. Perkins' grandmother had brought from Ireland. She wore it like an armor, doubled over the breast and thrown across her shoulder. She marched down the sidewalk into town, stopped passersby, pulled on knockers, and shouted over hedges. She was just about to cross Main Street when she heard a squawk, a deep, cackling tone that seized her heart with joy. She held her breath and listened for it again. The sound came, and Mrs. Perkins ran in its direction. When she stopped, she was standing in front of a large wooden monocle. She squinted her eyes and deciphered the words written across it. Dewey Optometry. Mrs. Perkin knew in passing who Thomas Dewey was and had often strolled by the oversized monocle that served as the sign to his business. But before that day, she had never given any thought to what an optometry shop was or what Thomas Dewey did there. She did not know that Thomas Dewey lived in 2 small rooms behind his shop, or that he enjoyed reading and rereading James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking series while consuming large amounts of cheese. She did not know that Thomas Dewey's father had owned and operated the shop before him, or that Thomas Dewey's grandfather had operated the shop before that. She did not know that Thomas Dewey's grandfather was originally a blacksmith and had inherited the building when his uncle was trampled by the horses of a passing carriage, or that his large black unassuming anvil was now used by Thomas as a bedside table. The bell on the door jingled as Mrs. Perkin entered. Thomas Dewey was in the back room, deeply ensconced in a copy of The Deerslayer and a piece of Gorgonzola. At the sound of the bell, he reluctantly laid down his book, brushed a few crumbs of cheese off his white coat, and opened the door that separated his living quarters. "May I help you?" he said quietly. For in his mind, he was still sliding through the woods with Deerslayer and Chingachgook around the edge of the Huron camp, waiting for the right moment to rescue Watawa. "Have you seen a black rooster?" Mrs. Perkin asked. As with most people who spend a substantial amount of time alone, Thomas Dewey often spoke aloud to himself in ways that might be found embarrassing. Mrs. Perkins' question rolled through his mind and into the woods. Deerslayer picked it up, looked it over, and gave him an answer. "The white bear follows his shadow to find his way in a strange forest." "What?" said Mrs. Perkin. She had a feeling that something lewd had just been proposed. She gathered her shawl tightly around her. "I'm sorry," said Thomas Dewey, and blushed. "There are no birds here." He looked to his left, then to his right, as though he did not trust his judgment. Mrs. Perkin followed his gaze over the rows of eye charts, the cases of frames, the boxes of lenses lined up on the counter, and was reminded of her laboratory in veterinary school. She let go of her shawl and noticed other things. Tears in the shades above the window where the light crackled through, soft gray films of dust, and streaks like ghosts on the windows. "I heard him," she said, "just a few minutes ago." "What does he sound like?" "He has a special voice," said Mrs. Perkins. "Like this?" Thomas Dewey cleared his throat and imitated an early morning cock-a-doodle-doo. "That's quite good," she said. "But his tone is higher, with more vibrato in the doodle." Thomas closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and let out another rooster call, quite close to Romeo's. "Amazing," said Mrs. Perkin. It's something of a pastime. Inspired by Cooper, Thomas Dewey had spent the last 12 years of his life memorizing bird calls of North America. Would you like to hear another? I should be on my way if he isn't here. I suppose so, said Thomas. But perhaps you could call him from the window. Of course. Thomas walked around the counter and opened the sash. He cupped his hands around his mouth and let out 3 different calls. Those last 2 were females. I'm so grateful. You might want to stay a bit and see if he comes. Thomas closed the window. I went to school, said Mrs. Perkin. I was going to be a nurse. I'm sure you would have been a good one, said Thomas. She clarified, for animals. I see, said Thomas. A collection of magnifying glasses hung on the wall behind him. They made Mrs. Perkin remember an experiment she had done in embryology. Fertilized eggs in different stages of incubation, cracked in a petri dish and studied under the scope. She'd seen mitosis, meiosis, and the development of the body. The bulb of a head, the curve of a spine, 2 dots appearing as eyes. When the students were finished, they dumped all the samples together in a bucket. Mrs. Perkin had held her broken egg, peered into the enormous mass of yellow, and paused. There were tiny bits of red spotting the yolks where the hearts of the birds were still beating. Later, when she'd told Mr. Perkin about it, he'd smiled and said, scrambled eggs. Mrs. Perkin looked over at the cases of frames on the counter. There were dozens of sizes and shapes, square, round, and oval, silver and gold. Maybe I need glasses, she said. Would you like me to examine you? No, I just want the frames. She picked out a silver pair with a thin pattern of vines engraved across the bridge and down the length of the arms. Mrs. Perkin put them on and looked in the mirror. She saw a woman older than she was. In the bathroom, Emmeline tried to remove the taffy from her hair. The high school girls gave words of comfort, but Emmeline shunned their offers of grease, soap, and tonic water. She could feel anger prickling along her skin, spreading with exasperation. She broke from the crowd, grabbed her coat from the closet, and left without saying goodbye. When Emmeline was a little girl, her father warned her about emotions. Her mother had always been prone to hysterics, which frequently drove her father out of the house to take long walks along the wharf. He often brought Emmeline with him. The 2 would move along in silence, Emmeline taking 3 steps for every one of her father's, doing her best to keep a look of preoccupation on her brow so that he would not feel the need to amuse her. On their way back home, Emmeline's father would inevitably pause and voice some conclusion he'd arrived at during the stroll. Sometimes they were about his wife, sometimes they were for Emmeline. Don't be like your mother, he said. Stay away. from the feelies. Emmeline considered this as she walked down Main Street with taffy in her hair. She thought of her father's final moments under the mound of bluefin tuna. She imagined the weight, the cold, wet slickness, the slowing beats of tails searching for water. She wondered if he'd been angry under the pile, or if he'd had time to feel anything at all. As she passed Thomas Dewey's shop, Emmeline noticed Michael Sheehy sprawled on the sidewalk beneath the large wooden monocle, a bottle of whiskey under his arm and 2 shiny black feathers in his hair. "Hello," said Michael. "I'm fired." "Well, you deserved it," said Emmeline. "You deserve a kick in your pants." "You are drunk." "Yes." "What are you doing here?" He pointed to the sign. "I want to get my eye fixed." Emmeline blushed. She thought of the high school girls imitating him, rolling their eyes and groping one another in the bathroom. "It's not that bad." "Yes, it is," said Michael. "And you don't have to live with it. So don't tell me what to do." "I'm not telling you anything." "I'm sorry. Forgive me." Michael Sheehy began to cry. He reached up and took hold of her skirt. Emmeline stood perfectly still and tried to control her emotions. The cloth pulled against her hip. Michael lifted the edge and wiped his face. A breeze touched her legs. If her father were here, he would disapprove. She was sure of it. Inside the optometry shop, Thomas Dewey was giving Mrs. Perkin a sampling of his calls. He had never had an audience before. He puckered his lips and did his best imitation of Deerslayer's whippoorwill song. Then he tried Chingachgook's secret signal for his lover, Watawa, the chatter of a North American squirrel. Mrs. Perkin listened politely as she kept her watch out the window. She peered through the glass, and this is what she saw. The girl who pulled the taffy in her husband's shop, the cashier with the lazy eye who rang it up, and stepping out of the bushes, Romeo. He looked as though he'd been in a fight. His feathers were ruffled, his comb was torn, and one of his wings was dragging behind him. He stepped carefully, gingerly, circling around Emmeline and the man crying at her feet. He hasn't had any breakfast, Mrs. Perkin thought. He must be cold and hungry. She watched Romeo's wing brushing the ground and thought back to Gallus, trying to determine which bones had been broken. She thought of the metacarpals, the long, thin, delicate fingers, and wondered if she could ever make them straight again. Romeo leapt in the air and landed on Emmeline's shoulder. She tried to shoo him off, But Romeo knew from his fighting days how to hold on. He dug one claw into her collarbone, the other into the side of her neck, and began viciously attacking her taffy. Emmeline screamed. Michael Sheehy let go of her skirt and got up from the sidewalk. He had always been afraid of birds. He held his whiskey bottle with both hands and tentatively used it to poke the rooster on Emmeline's shoulder. Off now, he said, off. As he pushed at Romeo with the spout, the bottle slipped from his hands and fell crashing to the sidewalk. Mr. Perkin heard the glass shutter as he turned on to Main Street. His wife had not brought him his lunch that day, and with the help of a cane, he was irritably making the trip home for a sandwich. Mr. Perkin was a businessman. He did not often miss opportunity. He looked at it, and when it came, he took it in hand. Mr. Perkin hobbled to Emmeline's side. He raised the cane over his shoulder. He swung, landing a blow to Romeo's head, and the bird toppled to the ground. Mr. Perkin then stood over the rooster and beat it to death with his cane. There were reasons, Mr. Perkin thought, for doing things. He believed in getting what he wanted. He also believed in taffy. It was his base on which he had built a life that pleased him. This is it, he thought as he broke the rooster's neck. This business, this taffy puller, this missing sandwich, this was who he was. There was blood spilling from the mouth of the bird, pooling on the hard, dry ground. Mr. Perkin moved his feet out of the way and noticed that his laces had come undone. It was inappropriate, he realized, to ask the girl he had just saved or the man he had just fired to tie his shoes. He glanced down Main Street, then at Thomas Dewey's shop. There was a woman standing in the window in a pair of silver frames, a black wrap around her shoulders. Her fingertips were pressed against the glass, 5 points spread like a mouth in surprise. Alan Perkins stood, laces trailing, and waited. Surely, he thought, he could depend on her to come. Gallus, Gallus.
Very nice.
They're funny sorts, those characters.
Animal Crackers is the name of these collection of short stories by Hannah Tinti. She has written a couple of novels as well. And I think now that you've heard a couple of those, you're going to want to read more.
I do.
Yes, she's really quite wonderful.
She's lovely. Thank you for introducing her.
Thank you for reading and reading so beautifully, you and Nina both. And I would like to invite everybody to join us February 17th, same time, same place, for the stories of John Updike, who is a very well-known short story writer, read for you by Pat Holleran and Corey Simpson, who may be known to some of you people from Thunder River. So it should be
Yay.
wonderful. And I'd like to thank Thunder River as always. Thank Sean Jeffries as always. And thank all of you for coming and listening. We'll look for you next time, huh?
Thank you.